Hi, everybody. So we're going to continue with the age of exploration after doing the document analyzation yesterday and learning about how it started. A lot of those explorers, you should be able to tell me who Prince Henry the Navigator is, Christopher Columbus, Cortez, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, Bartholomew Diaz, what country they sailed from, and what their major contributions were. So now, today we're going to talk about something called the price revolution and commercialization along with mercantilism. So we're going to start with the price revolution. So the influx or bringing in of all these new world goods, remember the new world applies to the Americas, um, all of this goods, including silver, had a dramatic impact on Europe, which we call the price revolution, which was basically just a drastic increase in goods, money supply, and prices. So the amount of goods are going to go up, the amount of money in circulation is going to go up, which also causes inflation, which means the price goes up. So think about it. If there's a lot more money, like if the United States government were to just start printing off a ton of money, money prices would rise because money would become worth less than what it is now, because the more there is of something, the less valuable it is. The massive flow of Spanish silver and American goods into Europe provided Europeans with plenty of cash from silver and trade. This drove the prices of goods up quickly, including the demand and prices for food, which was in short supply due to inefficient farming methods. And in a couple chapters coming up, we're going to start to talk about how that's going to change during the agricultural revolution. But still, all of this stuff is going to be in high demand. And if there's a high demand for it, there can also be high prices for it because people are willing to pay. So lords, nobles, and governments started to close off their land to peasants to harvest it more efficiently. This is called the enclosure movement. Basically, throughout a long time period of history, can you hear that thunder outside? I'm not sure if you'd be able to or not. But throughout these periods of history, there's what's known as common land, where peasants lived on land they didn't really own, but because there was so much of it, they were pretty much allowed to live freely, farm the fields, let their animals roam it, and so forth. But when the price of food starts going up and these wealthy landowners realize they can make even more money by selling it, they start kicking these people off of their land and closing in or putting up fences so no one can use the land besides themselves. As a result of that, landowners now became substantially more rich, and like I said, especially the ones who fenced off and organized their land to use it more efficiently. That leads us, as to I said, the enclosure movement. During the Middle Ages, European economies were dominated by large landowners who used peasant labor to grow and harvest crops. I think we all know that. Feudalism on manors, we should be all pretty familiar with that. Known as peasant agriculture, these peasants were bound to the land of their lord, paying him taxes and grain while being protected by the lord from hardship, attackers, things of that nature. Again, that's just a recap of feudalism. The land they lived on was largely unorganized and called common land that could be used for farming, foraging, hunting, really anything you needed it to be. However, beginning in England in the 1500s or the 16th century, due to the price revolution, lords began to close off their land from peasants to farm so they could make much more money. This is also going to start urbanization, which means the movement of people to cities, because when fences went up, there was no more job opportunities out in rural areas if you couldn't get a job as a farmer. So people began moving to cities, which are eventually going to become overcrowded, but we're still a little ways away from that. Fences were built, and peasants who remained were used in a more organized manner to plant and harvest crops. So the reason it was unorganized before is because it was a lot of subsistence farming, growing just enough food to eat. But as the price revolution came along and drove up prices and increased the demand for food and all of these other things, there was now a lot more money that could be made from selling farm products and food to people. So landowners seeing this took tighter control of their land so they could use it efficiently to sell more food and make more money. This brings us to commercialization. The enclosure movement was the beginning of commercialization in Europe, which is the harvesting and selling of crops by landowners for profit. So commercialization is when you're going to think about it. What is the point of a commercial? A commercial is to get you to buy something. Commercialization is when these farmers are going to start selling their crops to make money. They're no longer just subsistence farmers growing for just enough food to eat. they are now growing as much food as possible to sell to other people and make money for it. So they're going to commercialize agriculture rather than just the peasant agriculture or subsistence farming that existed in the Middle Ages. By the 16th century, some of the new economic ideas, such as printed money, banks, loans, and credit, made their way into Europe through Italy. Uh, Remember, the reason it would be in Italy first is because they were already doing a lot of trade and other things. It wasn't until the late 1400s when Prince Henry the Navigator and Christopher Columbus start sailing for Spain and Portugal, where really those two countries start getting in on this massive amount of trade as well. No longer did simply having land mean you had power. You needed to increase your power, you needed to have money. And most people, that meant having to sell goods. So that meant commercializing agriculture, growing as much food as possible, no longer just for yourself, your family, your town to eat. You wanted to sell it and make as much money off it as possible. The peasants didn't go quietly, however. Many openly rebelled when they were stripped of what they called their peasant rights. So, if you look at this objectively, peasants were upset because they were being kicked off of the land that they ancestors had lived on, for centuries before that, that common land that was really loosely organized that we talked about earlier. But it is the noble's land, it is the landowner's land. So, if we're judging, especially by today's standards, shouldn't people that own that land be able to do what they want with it? The peasants didn't think so, and they were upset their ways of life were being changed. So there are going to be many open rebellions. One of them being Kett's Rebellion in England in 1459. I'm sorry, 1549. So you would think that Kett would be the name of some, peasant that was leading a revolt. Excuse me. What it actually was, I'm dying here, forgive me, was the name of a wealthy landowner that put up fences himself. So he is beginning to put up fences, kicking peasants off of his land. But there's this group of hundreds of peasants that are going through, destroying the fences, destroying, attacking, killing wealthy landowners they come across, and basically trying to stop this enclosure movement. When they get to Kett's land and start tearing down his fences, he goes out to there, and instead of fighting them off, he goes out and says, talk to me. Like, why are you doing this? Like, this is my land. I'm trying to make a living. I'm trying to make money for my family. Why are you destroying it? And they have a conversation. They talk. The peasants talk about their hardships, and Kett really feels for them. They've lived this way for so long, and now they have nowhere to go. He actually becomes one of the leader of Kett's rebellion, and they go and they dismantle these fences and attack wealthy landowners and get into a lot of skirmishes. Eventually, the rebellion is put down. Kett is put on trial and killed for it. But it shows you that even the one thing I admire about this guy is commercialization, the enclosure movement helped him, but he realized how it hurt so many other peasants and people. So even though it hurt him, he was willing to still fight for these people's rights, which I think is pretty amazing. So now we get to the term mercantilism. It's basically an idea that there's only so much money in the world. It's a fixed wealth system, as I have there, belief that only a certain amount of money and resources exist in the world. Your state or country's goal was to control as much of it as possible because however much more another country had means less for you. There was three ways they tried to do this to get control of much of the money as possible. The first way was to disrupt enemy trade routes. Enemy trade routes was pretty much any other country that was trading, because again, if they were trading and making money, that means there was less for you. Using pirate tactics, they would hire pirates commissioned by the government, paid for by the government to go out and harass, sink, rob these ships. It was always every country was doing it, and every country knew that the other countries were doing it, but they weren't officially at war, if that makes sense. Like the country knew, like France knew England was messing with them. England knew France was messing with them. Well, I don't know if you can hear that thunder, but it's thunderstorming. They knew they were messing, but it was kind of unofficial through the government because it was private citizens that were doing that, not the army. Uh, they thought that way was the way to do it with avoiding a war. Another way to do this was to take over colonies. extort them for their resources, their gold and silver, their food, their labor, and also have a new market to sell things. In addition to stealing so many of the resources and food from these colonies, it's also important that it's a new market to sell things. If I sell everybody in a country, my brand new product, but now everybody has it, by taking over a colony, it allows me more people and a bigger, audience to sell to. And the third way was a tariff, which is a tax on an imported good. So they put tariffs on foreign good, which so less people in their country would buy that, and instead they would buy things made in their own country. And they wanted to have a favorable balance of trade, which means you export or sell more to other countries than you import or bring in. Yes, it's good to import cool things into your country so people can buy, but that costs money. Exporting, on the other hand, makes your country's money because you're the one selling it and making a profit off of it. The drastic rise in money supply, as well as new systems of banking and loans, allowed for more investment opportunities. And Monday, we're all going to zoom in and we're going to play a joint stock investment company game so you can kind of see how these work. This expanded joint stock investment companies, again, which we're going to talk about. But basically, it's like, how in the stock market you can invest in companies? A joint stock investment was you investing in a ship, its crew, and its exploration to go trade. Um, so basically, you're going to, let's say a ship is getting ready to sail and they need money for crew, supplies, the ship itself to sail somewhere, load up with goods, and bring it back and then sell it. If you contribute money to their voyage, you get a share of the profits when they come back. So it was a way for people to make a lot of money, but it's also very risky because, as we said, you have pirates, you have enemies, you have people out there that are trying to disrupt you as much as possible from getting back. Two of the most successful charter companies are the British East India Company and the Dutch East Indies Company. Uh, they're basically going to be, they work for the country they're from, but how it really works is they're basically their own business that has its own army, its own fleet of ships, and everything else that make as much money as possible off of colonies through trade. These companies then established new settlements in the New World and brought goods and profits back to enrich their mother country. So these, again, were separate from the government, but also often very approved by the government because it was helping to make that country more wealthy. I really like this as a political cartoon for mercantilism. You can see, the mother country sitting there and being served from the colonies, gold and silver, all these different types of food, raw materials, and eventually, slave labor with the encomienda system and the Atlantic African slave trade that begins too. And let's talk about agriculture a little bit. So while much of Western Europe was commercializing, exploring, and profiting during the 16th century, again, the same thing as the Renaissance. The people of Europe were still mostly peasants. While many were starting to make their way to cities because of the enclosure movement, peasant agriculture was still the dominant economic form. It's what most people still did. Notice we haven't talked about Poland or Russia or any of those kind of Eastern Europe places yet. The reason being is because up to this point in history, there was no real renaissance. There's really no commercialization. They're not along the Atlantic trade, so there's not really a lot of trade going on either. So Eastern Europe is going to stay in the Middle Ages and under feudalism manners a lot longer than Italy and other part of Western Europe that we're discussing. So keep that in mind. That's why we haven't talked about those places quite yet. And Poland, Hungary, and Russia, as I just said, all remained largely agricultural and tied to serfdom, aka feudalism. As a result, Eastern Europe nobles would hold the majority of power, as they did during the Middle Ages, and prevent Eastern Europe from growing economically. So Western Europe is starting to progress with the Renaissance and Age of Exploration. However, Eastern Europe is going to fall behind because there's no commercialization is going to occur there. The last part of this that we're going to talk about today is just some of the new inventions in banking and finance that are going to make these, that are going to develop from the age of exploration and make it possible. One is double entry bookkeeping, which is just a system to monitor the debts and credits to bank accounts to minimize errors. Basically, for every credit from one account to another, there should be a debt coming out of another one. So by keeping two separate lists, it really cuts down on the amount of errors because you're basically double checking every single move that gets made. The Bank of Amsterdam was a Netherlands bank that is really going to dominate during this time period. It has the first modern style checking accounts. It was a very trusted bank. People were trusted it to put their money in there, and it's going to finance a lot of the joint stock companies that we're going to talk more about on Monday. We talked about a little bit the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. In Dutch, it was created in 1602 to protect the state's trade in the Indian Ocean and to protect and assist the Dutch in the War of Independence of Spain, which we'll talk about going into the future. The company prospered through most of the 17th century as an instrument of powerful Dutch commerce and empire in the Indies. I really wouldn't worry about writing every single word of this down for the British East Company or Dutch East India Company. You just need to know basically what they did, how they controlled trade, set up colonies to help enrich some other country. The commercialization of agriculture and enclosure movement restricted the use of common land and forced people to migrate to the cities. We talked about that earlier. Eventually, so not quite yet, but over time, as more people move to these cities, over time, they're going to start to become crowded, unsanitary, poor, and crime ridden due to the strain put on resources by all of these people moving there. Again, this doesn't happen overnight. It's not happening, right in 1550. It is starting slowly to happen over time. And the joint stock company game is what we will do next week. Message me if you have any questions. As I said, going through on the Wednesday Zoom meeting, that going forward with the Protestant Reformation, which I believe is our next topic, I'm going to give guided notes a try to see if that makes it a little easier, since so many of you try to write down, every single word instead of just, kind of writing down and shorthanding the important things. Thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next week.